There's a dangerous pattern that runs all through the Bible. It's not obvious at first. It doesn't look like rebellion. It doesn't look like, flat out atheism. Here's what it looks like. It looks reasonable.
That'll work.
Here's how it goes. God makes a promise. Time passes. Pressure builds. And instead of rejecting God, people start replacing what he said in his promise with something that feels more realistic, more manageable, more immediate. And I'm telling you, every single time it happens, it creates a mess that lasts far longer than the moment that caused it.
I need to clean this up.
I'm coining a new phrase for something that happened all through the Bible and happens too much today. It's called replacement mythology. Not replacement theology, replacement mythology. Because this is what happens when human reasoning rewrites divine promises, and we see it a lot today. Well, how so, Pastor Rob? Well, here's the pattern. God speaks clearly, man gets impatient, man substitutes a solution, and the result is always damage, not partial damage, generational damage. Sometimes even hundreds or thousands of years of damage.
How far back does this thing go?
And what's fascinating is this. The people who made these mistakes weren't pagans in the Bible, not usually. They're usually people who believed in God, but just didn't trust him enough to wait. So here's our first example, Abraham and Sarah. It's found in Genesis 15 and 16. God gives Abraham a promise. Your very own son shall be your heir. That's Genesis 15:4. Not a very cryptic promise. It wasn't symbolic, not spiritualized, very specific.
I got it.
But here's what happens. Years go by and they're already old, and yet they don't have a child. And this is where replacement mythology begins. Sarah steps in with a solution. Genesis 16:2 finds that solution. I'm going to summarize it. Go into my servant, Hagar. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. Now, notice what didn't happen. They didn't reject God. They didn't deny his promise. They just reinterpreted how it would happen. And Abraham agrees with Sarah. So he does this deed, and Hagar conceives, and Ishmael is born, and the problem is solved.
Done and done.
No. Because later, God shows up and makes it crystal clear again. Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son. Genesis 17:19.
Look, I know this is difficult to understand at your age.
And Abraham says something revealing. In the next verse, he says, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. What does that mean? Well, translation, God, can't we just call this close enough? And God's answer is absolutely not. No. Well, why not? Because God does not bless substitutes for his promises. I'm going to say that twice. Remember it throughout the video. God does not bless substitutions for his promises. And worse, when you or I replace what God promised with what we can produce, you don't create fulfillment, you create conflict every time. And that conflict didn't stay in Genesis in the case of Abraham and Sarah. It spilled out into history. But that's the one most people know about, most biblically literate people know about. Let me give you another example. Saul. This is found in 1 Samuel 13. King Saul is given a clear command. Wait for the prophet Samuel. Do not offer the sacrifice, but wait. But the problem is Samuel's late, and pressure builds, and Saul's army is scattering, and the enemy is advancing, and so Saul decides to act.
I got this.
Here's that replacement mythology. Saul says in 1 Samuel 13:12, I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. That line says everything. Saul's saying, I forced this thing. Again, this isn't rebellion. It's impatience dressed up as leadership. He didn't reject God. He replaced obedience with urgency. And the moment he finishes, Samuel actually does arrive. And he says in 1 Samuel 13 through 14, Saul, you have done foolishly. Your kingdom, therefore, shall not continue. And a lot of people have looked at this and thought, wow, what a harsh punishment for a simple case of replacement mythology. Well, listen, impatience will always convince you that disobedience is a minor thing, and in this case, necessary, and Saul loses the kingdom. Not later, in that very moment. Let's take another example. Moses, in the book of Numbers, chapter 20. God gives Moses a simple instruction. Tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. Speak to it. That's Numbers 28. But Moses is frustrated with the people. He's angry. He's exhausted. He's impatient. So instead of speaking, he strikes the rock. Numbers 20:11. He struck the rock with his staff twice. What is that? Well, it's certainly not what God told him to do. And listen, this one's a lot more deceptive. Water still comes out. It works. The people get what they need. But God responds. Because you did not believe me, you shall not bring this assembly into the promised land. That's Numbers 20:12. Wow. Here's what I'm saying in plain English. Just because something produces results doesn't mean it reflects obedience. Moses replaced God's instruction with his own emotion, and it cost him the promised land. All right, let's zoom in a little bit. Step back and look at what we've seen. Abraham replaced promise with a human solution. Saul replaced obedience with urgency. Moses replaced instruction with emotion. Different solutions, same root problem. They stopped trusting God to fulfill his promises exactly like he said he would. And instead, they all replaced those promises. And every time, the consequences were very real and reveal how serious replacement mythology is to God. Now, here's where this gets serious, because this pattern didn't stay in personal decisions. It moved into theology. There's a widely held belief that God made promises to Israel, but those promises are no longer going to be fulfilled literally. Instead, they've been reassigned, redefined, especially just flat out replaced. And what some Christians believe today is called replacement theology, where the church becomes the new Israel. Now, that may sound sophisticated, but when you strip it down, it's the same pattern we've been talking about this entire video. It's really replacement mythology. All right, let's go back to Abraham. God said a specific people, a specific land, a specific future. And instead of waiting, many have said, let's reinterpret this because, it's been thousands of years since these promises were made. And it's been 2,000 since Jesus walked the earth, so something seems off. Maybe we should spiritualize this thing. Let's, make this apply differently now. But friends, that's not theology, that's replacement mythology. In fact, the same question Abraham asked all those years ago is still being asked today. Can't this just count? Can't this version work? Can't this reinterpretation be enough? And the answer from Scripture remains what it's always been. No, because God is not looking for creative reinterpretation. He's looking for faithful obedience and faithful expectation. Brothers and sisters, here's what we all need to understand. God does not revise his promises to match human timelines. He fulfills them according to his own. And every time we replace what God said, we don't improve the plan, we distort it. Friends, replacement mythology doesn't lead to clarity, ever. It leads to confusion, conflict, and sometimes very severe consequences. So the question is really pretty simple. Are you going to trust what God said or replace it with what feels easier to believe? That's exactly what the heresy of replacement theology does. I'm Rob Singleton, and I'll see you in the next video.